Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Secrets to Plant-Based Living Summit, how to use food to have radiant health, mental clarity, and boundless energy. I'm your host, Sandra Cotto, and I've brought together 21 of the most influential doctors, athletes, authors, chefs, and coaches to help you understand what plant-based living looks like, what it can do for your health, and how you can transform your life to live more vibrantly. I would like to give a very warm welcome to our guest today, Dr. T. Colin Campbell. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Campbell. So for decades, Dr. Campbell has been at the forefront of nutrition education and research. Dr. Campbell's expertise and scientific interests encompass relationships between diet and disease, particularly the causation of cancer. His legacy, the China Project, is one of the most comprehensive studies of health and nutrition ever conducted. Dr. Campbell is the co-author of the best-selling book, The China Study, Startling Implications for Diet, Weight Loss, and Long-Term Health, and author of the New York Times bestseller, Whole, and The Low-Carb Fraud. He is featured in several documentaries, including the blockbuster Forks Over Knives, Eating You Alive, Food Matters, Plant Pure Nation, and many others. He is the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies and the online plant-based nutrition certificate in partnership with eCornell. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for being on the show today. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that I am very honored to have you here today to be a part of my experts for this summit. I respect all that you do, all of the research that you have done to educate people about the power of plants and how our dietary lifestyle can actually reverse disease or actually promote it. Taking your course, the plant-based nutrition course 2 years ago, back in 2016, was really the beginning of my journey to transition into a second career, which is a plant-based eating health coach. And my goal is to really spread the word with everybody as much as I can about what a plant-based diet can do for you. And so I want to help those who want to transition. And so this summit is dear to my heart because I want people to have an opportunity to learn what are some ways that they can transition, learn a little bit more, of course, your expertise, the scientific background, and how people can really reverse disease and just feel better overall. So I want to thank you so much. I'm honored to have you here today.
Thank you.
And we're hoping that we can reach over 100,000 people with this summit so that they can have more information. And I think really the key is education, right? Learning and from the best. And I continue to keep learning from you and all the others as well on this lifestyle. So if we can first get started with, if you can just tell us, Dr. Campbell, a little bit about your journey and your background. I know that you grew up on a dairy farm. So can you just give us a little background about your journey and how this started for you?
Well, it's true. I was raised on a dairy farm, went away to school, eventually to graduate school at Cornell, did my doctorate dissertation on the idea that animal protein was something rather special. And so my research actually was intended to promote the consumption of more of that high quality protein, if you will. But then later I became involved in co-directing a study in the Philippines, a nationwide program feeding malnourished children. And there, the intent was to make sure that these children in that poor country got enough protein. So everything is going in down that line. But then I learned something while I was there that sort of challenged that thought. It was very provocative. It basically sort of came about that it looked like the higher protein consumption might be related to cancer. In this case, it was in children. It was really not believable. I was not inclined to believe that. But because we had that charge with the State Department to do that project, and with this kind of information that I thought I was getting, I thought it was important that we study the question, try to get an answer to it. So I got a grant from the National Institutes of Health, for the most part, with the National Cancer Institute of the NIH. And I held that grant for 27 years. It kept getting repeatedly renewed, and it was published extensively. We published a lot of papers on that. And I come to learn something that's very exciting. First off, it was true that at least in experimental animal settings, the higher consumption of protein, animal protein, turned on cancer. It was dramatic. At the same time, we also learned we could turn cancer on and off, which is the first time that had ever been demonstrated, because we think of cancer as a progressive kind of disease, and the only way you can stop it or treat it is to kill the cancer cells, such as with chemotherapy or radiotherapy, that sort of thing, or surgery in some cases. But in reality, we were learning that it was nutrition that controlled the progression of that disease. And still today, that's a hard pill to swallow for those in the trade. But I am pursuing that. I've written a number of papers on it, and especially a couple here just recently, very provocative papers just last year, discussing the biochemical basis for this particular idea. It's quite an extensive paper. And so now today, I'm very much aware, I mean, that the role of nutrition in cancer is very provocative. And so, but it's also, not hardly believable by a lot of people, especially people in the policy community. And I spent about 20 years on various policy boards in Washington and elsewhere, working out, what kind of thing that might be said to a public based on the experimental research that some of us in the field were doing. And I learned well the difficulty of selling this idea of not consuming animal protein,
right,
but in turn consuming plant-based foods, and I especially say whole plant-based foods. That whole idea is so provocative. And so I then wanted to get way about 30 years ago when I was at Oxford for a year. I wanted to find out what was the reason why there's so much resistance to this idea. I mean, it's well-published research.
right.
It's, all that peer-reviewed and the whole 9 yards. And so I spent a year looking at the history of this field in Oxford and London. And I'm just now getting around to publishing some of that. And I must tell you, of all the things I did in my career, I think this has got to be the most important. Because I learned, as you look back at the history, back to the late 1700s, quite frankly, even earlier than that, but in the 1700s, 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, during that period, it's very clear how, in fact, in modern medicine and modern medical science, how we took the wrong road. I'm really challenging the entire medical system. I'm especially challenging the cancer question itself, because in both of those cases, and more, I should say, in both of those cases, the idea came from a debate in the mid 1800s, a very lively debate, offering two different ways of thinking about the role of nutrition in the formation of disease, especially cancer. So it was a robust discussion, a robust debate. And there were two, as I say, two ideas. And I wrote that up in 1985. I'm continuing with that now. But it's very clear that of those two opposing theories of disease causation, we followed the wrong path. And we actually formed our medical system, again, around this wrong model. This may sound strange without getting into a lot of detail, but in reality, I'm very excited about that because history tells us enormous amounts of information. And I know how it unfolded, especially at the institutional level, like the professional societies, for example, and in various government programs and that sort of thing. And as I say, I was deeply involved in all of that as well as working in the laboratory. And so I can now see, it's an exciting concept. I'll just leave it at that. The idea of consuming whole foods is key to this message. There's two main ideas. First off, the message is such that we ought not to be consuming animal protein containing foods. And the second part of that message, make sure that we're eating whole foods, not the pieces and bits that we take out of the food. That's a source of enormous confusion for a lot of people, and it's one of the reasons that nutrition is not taught in medical schools.
That was one of my questions, right? Because a lot of people will say, well, how come my doctor never, told me about, eating foods? And for me, in my personal journey, When I decided to go plant-based 4 years ago, one of the things that really interests me, because I had suffered for many years with allergies and asthma, and I was on medications for over 20 years, inhalers, steroids. And when I did a 21-day raw vegan cleanse and then changed my diet, and it was just significant, the change that I felt. The inflammation had gone away, and I just felt fantastic. But yet none of my doctors had ever mentioned anything to me about, well, what are you eating or what's your diet like? So what do you say to that, Dr. Campbell?
Well, I can understand why they're so reluctant to accept a message like this, because as you said, there's not a medical school in the United States that teaches nutrition, not one. So first off, they don't have the information. Secondly, the information I'm talking about is that other theory.
Right.
That is not used by the medical profession itself. And so in a sense, they're living in one world, one paradigm, whereas I've come to learn there's another one. There's another one, and it's far more productive. And so I can understand, I have a great deal of respect, for our medical practitioners. Obviously, there was the good people, went to school to learn how to take care of people's health. So that's not the issue.
Right.
The issue I have is what is going on at the higher levels. Why aren't medical students taught this information? That's the question. And why aren't they reimbursed for services when they do decide to do it?
Mm.
That's probably even a more important issue, because obviously some physicians now are getting quite excited about this, but not easy for them to get reimbursed for services because of the 130 or so medical specialties that we have, the mechanism by which people are reimbursed to some extent. There's not one of those 130 is called nutrition, if you can believe that. So nutrition is totally excluded from professional conversations. And it has been that way for a long time. That was the purpose of my writing about the history. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Campbell, do you think over time, or do you see any changes going on with that, where this will be a part of the studies for the doctors, is to learn more about nutrition? Do you see that there's maybe a slow change, or do you see that happening?
That's a good question. First off, the basic idea is it's got to be a ground roots sort of activity. It's got to come from the ground up. And there's and many kinds of mechanisms, but one is what you're doing right now. Get out there and tell the story.
Right.
And the other is, of course, get doctors trained. When we begin to look at the question concerning knowledge, where it comes from, what is the knowledge, who's controlling it? Those are really important questions, because they in turn trigger, who's going to control the information. So I see changes coming. And I also see in the medical system, in medical schools, when I've spoken up to 800-900 physicians at a time. And I'm quite candid, and I basically explain, give the basis for what I'm talking about. I'm delighted to see that the number of physicians who are all of a sudden sometimes being angry that they weren't taught this information, but nonetheless coming on board. And so I see a lot of physicians now begin to transition into this system. I used to think that, bringing a message from top down.
Right.
Because I was working at very senior levels within the government, in a sense on the expert panel. So I got to know the kind of people who formed the information. I was on those committees myself. And so it gave me a perspective of what does top down really mean.
Mm.
And top down is not going to work. It might be helpful if some courageous people spoke about it honestly, but it's not going to work. So starting at the bottom level, and there, I would suggest too, it's really, really important to reach the younger people just coming into this business, students
Absolutely.
Graduate students and so forth. They're the ones that can carry the ball, because we're so locked into a very kind of, frankly, an onerous controlling system that's very difficult to break through.
Yeah, when you think about the meat industry, and the livestock industry, the big business that it is, I mean, I am sure they're fighting against this as well. Have you found a lot of resistance?
Oh yeah, I'm on their blacklist, have been for some years. Yeah, I mean, of course, the food that what many of us consume, in way in excess, those industries are huge. At the same time, while we're getting sick on those foods, we have another industry that comes into play to pretend to make us well. That's the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And whether they work collectively together is not really the question, but quite frankly, their interests dovetail. As long as people are eating the wrong kind of food, getting sick, they're making more customers for those who want to then say, oh, we can take care of that. We got some drugs here. So there's some very big industries that just, let's call it coincidence, just for the sake of the argument, that their interest is that they tend to support each other.
And the sad part is that, people are taking these medications and many different types of medications to help suppress one thing, but yet something else comes along, because of the medications that they're taking. And so it's just this vicious circle that keeps going round and round. And in particular, the standard American diet, so much processed foods and the meat and the dairy. So I would assume that in the standard American diet are 3 leading causes, right, of death or heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, right, which is related or linked to eating a lot of animal protein, correct?
Right. I would say animal protein containing foods, which is, obviously meat, dairy, and eggs.
Right.
I don't like to say animal protein alone, because although animal protein has some very specific and very damaging effects from a biochemical point of view, that's not the whole story. It's our almost cultish belief in animal protein that's existed for decades, more than a century. And we believe we have to have that. That should be at the center of our plate, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, when we do that, we displace the foods we should be consuming. So you see, it's a combined effect that if you study it singly, we don't see the magnitude of the effect when we do it that way.
Right.
When you put all this information together and you come up with some systems analysis, methodologies and that sort of thing, all of a sudden it becomes abundantly clear what the problem is. Right.
And so the biggest question that a lot of people even ask me, well, if I go plant-based, will I get enough protein? And this protein question is just constantly there because everyone is assuming that you can only get protein through your animal products, when we have the strongest animals on the planet, like gorillas and elephants, who are on a plant-based diet and are super strong. So what is your answer to the common question, where do you get your protein when you're on a plant-based diet?
2 parts of that question. First off, I just already alluded to it. And that is this cultish belief that we seem to have about animal protein. That's a very interesting question. It's partly cultural, psychosocial, if you will, economic. Right. So that's one thing that we've all come to believe as word from on high. But then the other kind of thing, we become addicted to that kind of food as well. And so once we get into that habit, maybe over generations, our mothers told us to eat this way, our grandmothers said, so forth and so on. We got into this sort of position. We can't fathom the idea that there might be something else out there that's not quite right. And so we've got to start, that comes about through education. Right. And I forget the first part of your question. It was, there was something else I was going to say, but we can get back to that.
Okay. Yeah. Just, what would you advise people when they say, well, where can I get my protein? And what foods?
Yeah, I remember what it was. A plant-based diet has all the protein we need. In fact, it has the ideal levels of protein. In fact, in some cases, it can have generous amounts of protein without harm. Because when it's consumed as whole food, and I'm talking about legumes and whole grains and so forth, they have plenty of protein, and we can get it up there somewhat higher. In that case, that extra protein is almost, if anything, beneficial when it's consumed as whole food.
Right. It's the cleanest protein that you can get, the best quality, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So just tell people we get all the protein we need from plants. No holds barred. And there's no one I've ever heard that can provide any information, at least to me, scientifically, that justifies taking more.
Yeah, and like you said, with the culture, I think everybody's just so brainwashed in this protein. When you think about these bodybuilders and people who are working out and taking all of these protein shakes and whey, and I know casein is a carcinogen, correct?
Technically, that's correct. It hasn't been shown officially. I say that because I'm familiar with that program very well. And so if we interpret our results on casein regarding those particular criteria, clearly casein is the most relevant carcinogen ever identified.
Wow.
Something that no one ever hears about, but I like to say it because it gets people's attention. Then I can show them, well, how do I say that?
Right, right.
Very clear.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing, amazing. So tell us specifically what's so bad about the animal protein. What are some of the negative effects that it has on our body and the dairy on our body?
Well, as I said, there are two parts of that question. When we look at a relationship of animal protein consumption versus disease, we have to take in consideration there are some specific effects of animal protein, but probably even more important is the distortion it causes in the kinds of foods we tend to consume. So we have to keep those two things in mind. First, the direct effects, and then the other I call indirect effects. On the direct effects, the animal protein actually increases the production of reactive oxygen species, we say, which advances cancer and supports aging and that sort of thing. Animal protein, and this has been known for more than 100 years, is the principal cause of increased blood cholesterol and the formation of heart disease. And in addition, when we did that in our laboratory for about 12 to 15 years, looking for the so-called mechanism, trying to understand how does this work? And just very briefly, every time we looked for a so-called biochemical mechanism, we essentially found one. So when protein is being consumed, it's a very complex system, of course. Right. When protein is being consumed, digested, absorbed, and so forth and so on, we found at least 10 so-called mechanisms all changing together. So causation, the concept of causation between cause and effect, the concept of causation is not linear, is not single event kind of thing. It's that basically a tsunami. It's almost a tsunami of metabolic reactions just gone amok. But at the same time, all of them operate in the same way.
Wow.
That is I think that's a fascinating concept because then you can't walk back from that information. You can't say, oh, there's another view. No, there isn't. There's no other view because the protein, when it's fed and, above levels, I should say, some of that protein can be used if that's the only kind of protein. In theory, it could be used for good purposes. But when we exceed the amount of protein we need, and plants will offer all we need, and then we don't need to have more. It's kind of silly.
Yeah, and I think I read something where there's maybe 3% of people who are actually deficient in protein. I mean, I haven't heard of anyone going to the doctor saying, I have a deficiency in protein. It's just been ingrained in us, right? I don't know if you've seen any of those cases or what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. When we went to the Philippines, that was one of the paramount concerns. That the reason these starving children and malnourished children in poor countries was for one of two reasons. One, they weren't getting enough food or enough calories, let's say. That was called marasmus. The other reason was very popular at the time. They weren't getting enough protein, and otherwise they get a condition called kwashiorkor. And I was at the Philippines actually looking for kwashiorkor cases and met with the person, that one doctor who probably knew most. He became the medical advisor to the president, in fact. And he showed me one person, one baby that may have had protein deficiency. And I brought him to this country and he gave some lectures. And he saw his first really classical case of kwashiorkor, the first he had really seen in his life in Richmond, Virginia. It's so rare. It is almost non-existent. And probably even in those couple of cases that I just mentioned, there are probably other factors that's contributed to that effect. So, kwashiorkor or protein deficiency is a vastly, vastly overstated concern. It just doesn't exist.
Okay, that's exactly what I was thinking too. Everybody's so concerned. I think it's just that culture that we've been in, that protein, or these high protein diets, low carb diets, which I don't agree with either. I don't know what your take is on these, that carbs is not good for you when we need the carbs.
Yeah, I wrote the book, Low Carb Fraud, explaining some of this, as you probably know. And so a lot of these ideas that have come up since the 1970s, I would say, these strange ideas like low carb, blood type, gluten sensitivity, on and on and on. These are efforts being made by people not trained in nutrition, no experience in experimental research, no professional publications, all of them, I'm saying all of them. What they're doing is they're trying to find a little bit of something else to talk about, to try to detract our attention away from the main story. And that's what the low carb phenomenon really is. It's a distraction. But it was a fairly successful distraction because, as my good friend Dr. John McDougall once said, and I've repeated it many times, people like to hear good things about their bad habits.
Right,
so
supporting it, right?
I give that to Dr. McDougall, but in any case, it's so true.
Right.
So people can come out with these kind of books and, make food sound all of a sudden appealing for one specific, or I should say, specious reasoning that just doesn't hold any water. Fake news. Let's call it fake news.
Fake news. I like it. Great. So, Dr. Campbell, your book, The China Study, the most comprehensive study of nutrition ever conducted. So let me just ask you, I know some people have asked me, so why the China study? Why in China? Can you give us kind of a brief overview as to why the study was conducted there?
A couple of different questions. First off, it was a rather interesting opportunity to do this in China. I had been working in a laboratory for many years, getting these ideas, and finally an opportunity was presented to me when the first senior scientist from China came to the United States. He came to work in my lab. So while he was here, we learned about what his government had just done. They had just completed an atlas of the amount of disease occurrence in 2,500 counties across China. So all of a sudden, here was a case where here's a country that had very high rates of cancer in certain areas, certain counties, much lower rates than others. So let's go do a study. So the study was organized, a joint study between the United States, China, and Great Britain, Oxford University specifically. And we wanted to organize this study to survey a total of, let's say, 130 villages across the country. It was very comprehensive. And we took blood samples and urine samples and food samples. We measured lots of things because I was interested at that time to see if there are any certain patterns related to that. And then later, the Chinese government gave to us other mortality rates besides cancer. So the China study morphed into a very comprehensive, big study involving all kinds of possible causes, lifestyle, diet, and so forth, compared against all kinds of disease rates. That was the reason. Now, there's another part of that question I do have to say something about. The book was called The China Study. That was a mistake. I'm really kind of still bothered by that.
Oh, okay.
When my son, who now is a physician, Tom and I, we finished writing the book, and we offered, I think it was something like 200 possible titles to our publisher. He didn't take any of our suggestions. He came up with this word, the China study. And I said, I object. I don't like it because it puts too much focus on one study, and sends out other signals. But he said, you already signed a contract. And he had the right to name it. I mean, I could have walked away, but I already had walked away from other publishers, and he was going to let us publish and do what we wanted to do.
Right.
So I finally said, with reluctance, okay, call it the China study. But I had another name for it, something like sense and nonsense, nutritional sense and nonsense, or something of that sort. My son had The Great Food Secret. It was his favorite, I think.
Oh, wow.
So the China study came out, and I've had to live with that problem for all the days since, because too many people think that I'm drawing conclusions in that book only from the China study. But that's nonsense. That's not true.
Right.
It was very helpful. And the way it became helpful was because the information in that people study coincided with what I was seeing in a mechanistic sense in the laboratory. That's where the strength of the message comes from. You combined information from two vastly different bodies of data. Then we really have something.
Right.
Especially if you start looking at it in another context, like doing intervention studies. That's what a number of my friends are doing, and family actually. put people on this kind of diet and see what happens in a week or two.
Mm.
That's very exciting. It's another sort of angle to look at this question. And then you can go back and look at some of the other kinds of data that have been collected over the years. And when you stack it all up, we had just a lot of bricks before, I think.
Right.
Now I think we have a house. And that's the way it is.
Right, right. Well, we're super happy that you did write the book. There's a lot of great information in there for everyone to learn from. So, Dr. Campbell, what advice can you give for those who are interested in this lifestyle? They want to transition. They kind of don't know where to start. What would you suggest for them? What would you advise a good way to approach it for someone, for themselves, and maybe even for their family? Because it can be difficult sometimes when one person is all plant-based, but the rest of the family isn't. And how do you kind of get them on board and not feel so alone in this? Like, oh, wait a minute, you're just eating, whole foods. And people tend to think it's just about salads, but there's so many wonderful fruits and veggies and grains and beans out there that could really be an amazing, amazing meal every day. So what would you advise?
The family should get around, first off, and watch a documentary film or two.
Mm.
The Forks Over Knives had a major, major impact, as you may know.
Yes.
The Plant Pure Nation, which was directed by my oldest son, that was a question concerning, well, why haven't people heard this before? And of course, that was conducted in the legislature in Kentucky. So watch a couple of films.
Great advice.
Of course, I think it goes without saying they ought to read the book, the China study.
Absolutely.
So you put that together, and then thirdly, just try it for 10 days or 20 days. And don't stray. If they want to get a true test of what it can do, don't stray and see what happens. They could take some before and after clinicals like blood cholesterol and that sort of thing and see what happens. They can also feel how they feel, their improved health. And so they should do it the whole way. And as I say, don't kind of mess around, tickling around the edges, but just use only whole food plant-based diet. Or whole plant-based foods.
Right. And so when we say whole foods, we're talking from the earth in its natural form, not processed like a lot of the foods that have labels, right? So it's eating fruits, veggies, fresh produce.
That's right. Stay with that for a while. One more thing I would add for some of those folks who still are reluctant, they should remember that the food they're accustomed to, and I was too, we all were,
sure.
The food they were accustomed to was a result of basically addictions to high fat intake, addictions to sugar and so forth. And and they tend to disappear after maybe a month, sometimes sooner for a lot of people, but in any case, they do disappear. And once we get to that new territory,
yes.
a new taste experience, then you look back and you say, how in the world did I ever eat that stuff before?
Right.
Comes down to it.
Yeah, you start eating clean and then you go back to these foods. They don't taste the same. They don't taste as good because our palate gets used to eating that clean, fresh, whole food. And you really get to taste the differences between all the fruits and veggies that you probably wouldn't be able to really get a good taste of it before because of all the processed foods and the meat and the dairy that's crowding out.
One more caveat I should say too, as part of the message I said whole foods. What I'm referring to, and especially supplements don't really work. That's number one. That's not a substitute between supplements. And also, don't add back oil to the diet or sugar. Try to keep that at an absolute minimum because oil, especially the kind of oil we tend to use, is kind of pro-inflammatory. So it has disease-producing capability, and that also just feeds our addiction. So cut out the oil, cut out the sugars as much as possible. Stay with all foods.
Yeah. So now that you mentioned supplements, what is your take on a B12 supplement for those who are on a whole food plant-based diet, not eating any animal products? Do you feel it's necessary to take one on a daily basis or a specific kind?
Well, I held out on that, quite frankly. It wasn't even in the beginning from the research perspective. There's more work that needs to be done on that question from my point of view. And there is some information coming out recently that too much B12 might be a problem, which I find a little surprising. But in any case, I was there, so safe supplement, if you will. B12 levels in our blood do go down when we go to a plant-based diet. I don't think that's a concern, but some did. And so finally, my clinician friends who actually saw cases where people were apparently suffering some problems with low B12, so they took the B12 supplement, and they saw some benefits. So I defer to their experience, and yeah, that's fair enough. It's probably a good idea, I think, at this point in time.
Right, right. Until we can get more research on it. And okay, great. Thank you so much. So I have one last question for you, Dr. Campbell. It's a question I've been asking all my experts, just something fun to share with the listeners. If you were on a deserted island and you could have one fruit and one veggie, what would that be for you?
Well, I wouldn't rely, if possible, on just one of anything, because first off, variety is important. And I like to think of food as, starting with the roots of the plant, the tuber, if you will, coming up the stem, like celery and that sort of thing, up to the leaves, to the fruiting bodies, we say in botany, to the fruits and so forth, the flowers. I mean, the whole nine, the whole plant. So, and it's amazing, what the different parts of the plant can do. I mean, I just heard yesterday that the leaves of sweet potatoes are very tasty and very good. I never heard that before.
Oh, wow. Yeah, me either.
But it's another one of our sons just told me that he has a garden. So anyhow, so plants have so many parts to them, and there's some different kinds of taste. And of course, there's all kinds of fruits as well.
Right.
And then I grains or tubers to get a source of energy.
Right.
So on that island, that hypothetical island you talk about, I think there's going to be plants growing there.
Okay.
If there's animals, just leave them alone.
Right, right. Okay, well, thank you so much for all your information and your insight. So, Dr. Campbell, you are offering all of our listeners today an amazing free gift. And you mentioned a discounted scholarship for one of your online programs. Can you tell us a little bit more about your online programs and what could possibly be an option for our listeners?
Yes, it began with lectures I was giving on the campus at Cornell for a few years. And then it got a little bit sticky at that time. And so we put it into that was in the early days of the internet business. And so a bunch of my students actually got together to film me and some of this information to put it online. That's where it started from. And I went along with it a little bit reluctantly, to be honest, about in the beginning, because then I'm always teaching in classrooms. I found it hard to believe that we could do that kind of stuff online. But anyhow, it was done. And then we had that put together and improved it some. We're going to make now big improvements still further. But we partnered with Cornell, with the online program at Cornell. And that was new in those days, too. It was kind of floundering. And we actually have been listed for some time now as the #1 online course at the Cornell program. Of the 200 and some programs, we're #1.
Fantastic.
And, doctors can get, doctors and other professionals can get continuing medical education credits as well. And so we're just in the process now making some revisions. That's very exciting. New dimensions. I think maybe this is the first time I'm saying this. We're going to have a session on food and the environment.
Oh, I love it.
I should say that the environment is a big issue. We all know that. And the role that food plays into that is something a lot of people don't know.
Right.
They certainly don't understand. So we'll add that to it and some of these other kinds of twists to the course.
Okay.
But it's been kind of fun. We've had a lot of people like yourself taking the course and going out and doing great things. And that's what it was intended to do.
Yes, absolutely. And I said, it's changed my life completely. I would never have thought 4 years ago that I'd be where I'm at today in changing my career and having such a passion for this lifestyle, because it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. And that's what I try to tell people. They're like, oh, your diet. I'm like, no, this is the way I live. I love it. I feel fantastic. It's helped me to alleviate a lot of my symptoms and get off a lot of medications that I was on for many years. And I really want to continue to spread that word. And so, Dr. Campbell, I am so honored and so grateful that you were our guest today. And I hope that everyone watching really got a lot out of today's interview. I feel like we could talk longer. I don't know, Dr. Campbell, I may have to have you on another time when I do another summit. I'd love to have you back on to talk some more.
Well, I'm writing a new book, maybe after that's done.
Oh, excellent.
I'm very
What's your
excited
new
about
book
this
going to
new
be
book.
about?
Well, tentatively, just to hint at what it might be, I have a tentative title. I'm not sure I'll use it. It's called Behind the Curtain.
Ah,
Because I was in the policy areas and testifying before Congress and doing all that kinds of stuff as this information was coming out. So I had a lot of opportunity to participate directly, in how science, if you will, gets translated into public information. It's not a very pretty picture. And so I've seen that. I've paid some prices for saying things about it, but that's what the book is going to be, and it's going to be provocative, because I say we first have to change the definition of nutrition, number one.
right.
Number two, change the definition of cancer. Both of them are really messed up, and so and then also make clear, how information that's honestly obtained, how that gets distorted by the time it reaches the public.
Right.
It's really kind of ridiculous. Pull that phone off. Sorry. So there you have it. Oh, by the way, I'm not sure the details of this course thing. It's going to be a good one. I'll have to communicate with you later.
Okay. No, absolutely. That'll be great. Thank you so much.
I hope it will be a full scholarship.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Dr. Campbell, again, thank you so much for your time today and sharing all of your research and your wisdom with us. And to the listeners today, thank you for tuning in. I hope you got a lot out of it, and that please share this with everyone that you know, your friends, your family members, so they too can see what this lifestyle can do for them. So continue to keep watching. We'll have more experts on. Dr. Campbell, thank you again. So appreciate you being here today. It was an honor. Bye for now. We'll see you all soon. Thank you.